This podcast is made possible by financial support from our listeners. If you're not supporting us yet, check out 90milesfromneedles.com/donate or text the word needles to 53555. Imagine we found a country the size of France that was covered in ancient forest, where trees a century old were mere saplings just getting started in life, where the oldest trees sprouted when near mythical monsters roamed the landscape. Imagine visiting this country and standing outside in one spot or another and watching. Maybe you've left your cabin on an errand. Maybe you just went out to get some air. You walk half a block from the place you're staying, caught up in one seemingly important thought or another, and you suddenly realize that within your field of vision, you see 3 trees that are each more than 1,000 years old. You turn your head and you see 2 more. You continue to walk, seeing the open park-like forest with new eyes, the unimaginable ancientness of it everywhere you look. Trees that are 700 years old, 1,000 years old, 3,000 years old. You rack your brain for half-remembered scraps of human history. Let's see. That tree probably sprouted before the Buddha was born. And that one over there probably germinated when Homer had the Iliad in first draft. Every now and then you find a tree that likely began life before the Bronze Age. And while you're imagining all this, imagine further that as you really see these ancient trees for the first time, you remember hearing about 100 different plans to cut them all down. Not because the timber is valuable, not because people need centuries-old firewood, but just because people have deemed this incredibly ancient forest worthless. They've decided that the land the forest occupies could be better used for other things, and so they plan to bulldoze it, stack the trees in big debris piles to rot, and build their far more important parking lots or garbage dumps or strip malls. This country, this forest, they actually exist. I live here. Of course, the trees rarely exceed 10 feet in height. Many of them are well known to science: the Mojave yucca, the diamond cholla, the buckhorn cholla, Mormon tea, but mostly, and almost everywhere you look below 5,000 feet in the Mojave Desert, the Sonoran Desert, and the Chihuahuan Desert is creosote. The oldest known creosote bush, at least the one whose age is public knowledge, is about 40 miles from my house, and it's a bit more than 11,700 years old, according to the estimates. To the untrained eye, it looks like a ring of seemingly independent and, frankly, not very impressive shrubs, but 11,000 years ago, more or less, a single creosote seed germinated. It grew, it made leaves, and eventually made stems, which made more leaves, and flowers, and fruit. And every once in a while, the stems, right where they emerged from the roots, just below the soil level, would grow side offshoots that would emerge right next to the stem. And those new shoots would grow into new stems, which would themselves grow new offshoots. The clump expanded, and after another century or 5, the oldest stems in the center of the clump began to die, leaving a widening hole in the center of the creosote. That 11,700-year-old creosote, which for a tiny fraction of its life has been known familiarly as king clone, which my former co-host and I visited in episode 1 of season 2 of this podcast, expanded outward across the Mojave landscape, across the millennia, at an average rate of 3/4 of a millimeter per year. King clone is not unique. It's probably not the only creosote that's that old. There may well be others scientists know about where they've decided to keep the location secret for fear of vandalism. But extreme old age aside, I can tell you this much. When I walk around my neighborhood, I pass within stone-throwing distance of 2 or 3 dozen smaller rings, some of them 12 feet across at the soil level. If you do the math and you use a much more conservative millimeter per year rather than 3/4, just to defend against charges of hyperbole, that works out to 300 years of age for every foot in width, measured where the stems come out of the ground. Creosotes that are older than 500 years are as common as dirt where I live. And actually, I mean that literally. Just about the only humus you'll find in this part of the desert gathers at the base of those creosote clumps. when you see plans to develop the desert for one project or another, if creosote is mentioned, it's only to identify the kind of habitat it dominates. It's not a special status species. It's barely a regular status species. Creosote is ubiquitous in the desert. And metaphorically speaking, environmentalists often peer through the creosote branches hoping to see something interesting on the other side. I increasingly find creosote fascinating for its own sake. I've seen creosote clonal rings 1,500 years old on the footprints of proposed desert solar facilities, at the verges of dirt roads and off-road vehicle sacrifice areas. I've seen millennia-old creosotes festooned with discarded plastic bags in vacant lots next to chain drugstores. They make up the only ancient forest I've ever heard of that no one sees, even though they look square at it. I see it lately, and it tears my heart. And once you see it, it cannot be unseen.
Think the deserts are barren wastelands? Think again. It's time for 90 Miles from Needles, the Desert Protection Podcast.
Thank you, Joe, and welcome to yet another episode of 90 Miles from Needles, the Desert Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Clarke, and today we are talking about very old plants in the desert. We started off with a story about creosote, the ancient plant that people are most likely to have heard about with regard to its occasional impressive age. And this topic, to be honest, came to mind because of an honest mistake I saw in a piece written by someone I admired greatly. It wasn't a huge mistake. It didn't undermine the piece, and I know pretty much how the mistake was made, because a lot of people have made it. There are sources out in the world that if you're not familiar with a topic to the point where you are constantly immersed in the veracity of different sources, if you don't check those sources really, really thoroughly, you might think they're reputable. Whereas what they're actually doing is just repeating folklore that they heard somewhere else. And it gets copied and pasted and copied and pasted. And this was in a really good article about Joshua trees. The mistake was a throwaway line about how some Joshua trees can live for thousands of years. And in the strictest technical sense, that is not entirely false, but it's not true in the way people would expect. It's true only really in limited circumstances that we will touch on later in this episode. An individual stem of a Joshua tree has a life expectancy somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 years. The trees are fragile. They break. They succumb to windstorms. They succumb to damage by small animals trying to get water in dry times. It's really common to drive through or walk through parts of the Mojave Desert where Joshua trees live and see trees that have fallen over and broken and shed limbs. At any rate, it's accepted these days that only rare Joshua tree makes it past 250 years old. They grow pretty slowly compared to, let's say, the corn in your vegetable garden, but for desert plants, they grow pretty quickly, and plants that grow quickly tend to be short-lived. They tend to be fragile. People that like desert trees have long found it a little hard to tell precisely how old Joshua trees are. There's a reason for this. Joshua trees are monocots. They're more closely related to grasses than they are to, say, pines and oaks, which means they don't have annual growth rings, the kind that you see when you cut down or take a core sample of one of those pines or oaks. In those trees, you see each year's growth recorded in a series of light and dark concentric rings in the cross-section of the trunk. And Joshua trees don't have that. You can't just cut them down and count the rings to see how many years old they are or were. And so, up until fairly recently, like in the last 30 years or so, we didn't have enough experience with Joshua trees, at least those of us immersed in the Western science mindset. Our experience didn't reach far back enough that we had a good idea of how long the things live. Settlers of European ancestry, after all, have only been in the Mojave Desert for a little bit less than one typical Joshua tree lifespan. And in the absence of a really obvious physical clue to the age of a plant like those annual growth rings, we're going to talk more about the ways in which scientists have approached the topic of seeing what kind of longevity desert plants can expect and which plants are the surprising winners of that contest as far as life expectancy. But first, if you're a faithful listener to 90 Miles from Needles, you know that the show is made possible by listeners just like you. We are not collecting grants or advertising revenue or foundation funding at the moment. We're not opposed to those, and we're going to be looking into them. But right now, this is all supported by your modest to generous donations from listeners just like you. $5 or $10 or $20 a month, occasionally more. If you want to join a group of people that's been making these episodes of 90 Miles from Needles possible, you can go to 90milesfromneedles.com/donate to find a couple of easy ways to toss us cash. If you're driving while you're listening to this and you have access to hands-free texting, you can text the word needles to 53555. And in reply, you will get a link to our donation page. We are so grateful to our listeners that support us. And if you're not one of them, we'd really appreciate you joining. It does take money to put this podcast out. We have expenses ranging from travel and lodging to cover issues in the field on up to, taking an example from this past month, filing fictitious business name statements with a local county and paying money to have the classified ads notify people of that business name. We have the occasional batch of t-shirts to print up. We have subscription fees to things like our web host and the apps that we use to edit and put together the podcast, subscription fees to royalty-free music site. Insurance, because every once in a while we put out a story on somebody dumping motor oil in the creek, and there's always the chance that they will sue us for that. It just takes money to put this together, and that's not even talking about promoting the podcast to new audiences. There are a bunch of different ways we could be doing that we just can't afford to right now. What I'm saying is all donations are welcome. If you listened to our last episode, you will know that Mazamar Art Pottery Studio in Pioneer Town, California, is putting together a summer group show focusing on the issue of preserving dark night skies in the desert. Mazamar is a pottery studio, but the show is open to any media that are appropriate for an outdoor exhibit. The deadline for submissions to the show is June 10th, 2024. And we are involved because Mazamar is asking for a small donation per entry, and that money is going to be donated to support 90 Miles from Needles and the Desert Advocacy Media Network. We are incredibly grateful for that show's support. Thomas and Sheila have been good friends since we launched the podcast, and we thank them very much. I'll be there at the opening of the show on June 15th in Pioneer Town on Main Street, M-A-N-E, for those of you who are new to Pioneer Town and its singular aesthetic. Again, deadline for submissions for the show is June 10th. You can email info@mazamar.com, MAZAMAR.com to participate, or check out Mazamar's Instagram feed at Mazamar Art Pottery. We're happy to spread the love, and we encourage you to check them out. One more announcement really quick before we jump into the main body of the podcast. The Desert Advocacy Media Network, which is our home in the nonprofit world, has a new project called Desert News, which is a weekly roundup of all the news we can find about environmental issues in the deserts of North America. This email newsletter comes out every Monday. You can subscribe and have it emailed to your address of choice. Check it out at desertnews.substack.com. Subscribing is free. If you like what you see, share it around. Tell your friends. Word of mouth is really important. Okay, so how do you find out how old a desert plant is if you can't take a core sample and count the annual growth rings? Either because those growth rings aren't there, as in the case of Joshua trees and saguaros and agaves and similar plants, or because the growth rings are not going to tell the whole story. I mean, sometimes bristlecone pines, for instance, have living tissue growing in just a strip down the trunk, and that strip may well move around a little bit. And most of the trunk will look dead, and there'll be a little thin living strip of tissue counting the rings in that case may be a little trickier than you expect. So how do you tell how old a plant is if you don't have those rings and you can't count on them? It's not easy. There are a couple of reasons for that. First off, I already mentioned the fact that Western scientific observers have not been around in the deserts for more than 150 years or so. And so anything that's more than a couple centuries old needs to have been first noticed and then documented in a way that people can find the documentation and see that the plant is still there. There are ways you can do this. A lot of the time, though, what scientists really want to find out is not necessarily how old an individual plant is. I mean, that's fascinating, but it's kind of a curiosity rather than an important scientific fact. What's more important to scientists is finding out how old plants like that can expect to get, or how old they can get, even if most of them don't get that old. This has a lot more to do with how the desert works than the lifespan of an individual plant. And so we'll be talking both about finding the age of individual plants and finding life expectancies of individual plant species in some places. And they're both really fascinating. We do have a study for each one of these examples. We'll take the individual plants one first. There is a sort of objective way of recording what was in the desert historically that Western settler type travelers did take part in at the time, even though the people that did this documentation may not have intended to document the plants at all. And what I'm talking about is old photographs from the late 19th century, early 20th century that are far enough back in time that we can get a real, sorry about this, but we can get a real snapshot from these photographs of the vegetation in the area at a known date. And then we can go back and either rephotograph the area or just examine it and find out that, for instance, an individual shrub or bunchgrass or tree or agave or cactus or whatever was there in 1860 and is still there in 2010. And that's a really good way of determining the age of the individual plants in the photos. And you can also extrapolate from that data to get a better sense of the expected lifespan of some of these plants. I have a personal example of that, which I was tickled to find. About a dozen years ago, I was going through a database of historic photos that were taken by a photographer named Burton Fraser. In the 1920s and 30s, Fraser was a professional photographer, and he would take pictures of things, scenery, plants, animals, mines, trains, picturesque things from all around the West. He would print them up as postcards and sell them in souvenir places like Fred Harvey stores at train stations and hotels and gas stations and diners and that kind of thing. And there was a photo of his I found in this database that he took in 1926 that there was something nagging at the back of my head about this photo. There was a Joshua tree in the photo in Centennial Flat, just west of Panamint Valley and Death Valley. There's just something about the way this Joshua tree was branching. It was youngish. It had maybe 8 branches on it, but there was just something about the way it was growing that looked really familiar. On a hunch, I found a copy of a more recent photo of Centennial Flat by a professional photographer named Anton Corbin. He took a photo that happened to have a bunch of Irish rock and roll musicians standing around in front of Joshua trees. And that album, The Joshua Tree by U2, has a photo of a very distinctive Joshua tree in it that was much older looking, had a lot more branches, a lot more character to it. Didn't look young and exuberant. It looked ancient and venerable. And despite that, it's pretty obvious it's the same tree. If you look at both photos, and I'll have them both in the show notes, the Burton Fraser photo from 1926 is 50 years younger than the Anton Corbin U2 Joshua tree, which means that this sort of youthful, vigorous-looking plant became a venerable-looking plant in less than 60 years. That's a pretty human scale of time. It's not bristlecone pine time. This is human time. And in fact, 20 years after Anton Corbin took that photo, that tree was lying dead on the ground. I have been to the spot a couple of times. There's a plaque there that U2 fans have mounted in the ground. That's an example of an inadvertent rephotography experiment. Wasn't deliberate. For an example of a more deliberate study, let's take a look at one done by Janice Bowers, Robert Webb, and René Rondeau, published in the Journal of Vegetation Science in 1995. Between 1985 and 95, these scientists acquired 1,500-ish photographs of the Grand Canyon area from a bunch of archives. There were 500 of them taken in 1889 and 1890, about 200 taken in 1923, and then some from the 70s and 80s. This is a very methodical attempt to locate older photographs and then find newer photographs or take them. During this study period, the scientists replicated almost 1,200 of the photographs, and they looked at all of them and they found photographs in which they could confidently identify the shrubs in the photographs and compared older images with newer images. And I will spare you the methodology. Personally, I find it fascinating to listen to podcasts that are essentially spreadsheets of plant Latin names with numbers attached, but I recognize that my tastes are not the majority taste. So we'll link to the studies we talk about in the show notes. You can check them out. All the math is in there. One of the things that Bowers, Webb, and Rondeau found out was that there are some plants that had been given fairly high estimates of potential lifespan that maybe actually didn't deserve those estimates. Barrel cacti, for one thing. Phaerocactus cylindraceus, a very common barrel cactus in the Mojave and Sonoran deserts, had previously been estimated to live up to around 90 years or so. And Bowers et al. Found evidence that it maybe has a maximum life expectancy of 50 years. That's a little surprising. But they also made discoveries in the opposite direction. There's Ambrosia salsola, which is a bursage in the ragweed family, kind of an opportunistic plant. It's native. It grows really quickly in disturbed areas, and Bowers et al. Found ambrosia might actually be able to live more than a century. The study also found out that shad scale, Atriplex camphortifolia, might be able to reach a century. It's not a particularly sturdy-looking plant. It's not the kind of plant you would look at and think, oh, this will last for 100 years. But they found that of 19 individual shad scale plants in photographs from 1890, 13 of them had lived until 1995. That's a good 105 years. Beaver tail cactus, 25 of the 34 beaver tail cacti in the 1890 photographs made it all the way to 1995. The one that surprised me was a bunch grass, big gaieta grass, Hilaria rigida or Pleurophis rigida, depending on which botanist you listen to. 43 of 63 clumps of big gaieta grass in the 1890 photographs survived until 1995. The authors suggested that 4 other species of perennial grasses could live that long. You don't really think of perennial grasses as living for more than a decade. They're kind of ephemeral seeming, but if they can last a century, that's pretty impressive. Cat claw acacia, Senegalia gregii, 234 of 274 individuals survived for that 105-year lifespan. They also found ephedra and creosote and Lycium andersoni, aka wolfberry, and narrowleaf yucca all survived that century-long period in impressive numbers. So historic photos are really important. They're really wonderful aids if you can find them, but sometimes they just aren't available. And in that case, you have to do longitudinal studies in which you or your colleagues have personally witnessed both ends of the time frame. In 1981, Martin Cody of UCLA's biology department went out to an area now included in Mojave National Preserve and with some associates laid out a 360 square meter plot of Mojave desert vegetation, not too far from the Granite Mountains, on the south side of the Granite Mountains, in fact, in what's now Mojave National Preserve. 360 square meters, for those of you who don't do metric, is just under 4,000 square feet. So Cody and his colleagues mapped the individual plants, anything greater than 5 centimeters high, so 2 inches or so, measured them, tagged them, recorded the species, and then 15 years later went out and resurveyed the same plot. So they had very detailed earlier data sets to work from. The first thing that's really notable about this study is that on this 360 square meter plot, they found 22 different species of woody plants. That's a lot of biological diversity. And In fact, another species started growing in between 1980 and 1995, Stipa speciosa, a bunch grass. It was recorded in the later survey, not in the earlier one. So the plot actually apparently became more biologically diverse in the intervening time. So that's pretty interesting. But more importantly, since Cody had access to this diverse set of life data for 312 individual plants of 22 different species, Cody was able to do what we might call actuarial math. And to the degree he could with the data he had, he figured out both the median lifespan that could be expected from these plants, the lifespan that half the plants were under and half the plants were over. And that was pretty impressive for a lot of the plants, in excess of a century for many of them. But he also looked at the long tail on the right-hand distribution in the bell curve of longevity of these plants to map what a minority of plants, the longest lived 5% of each species, might get up to in age. And he got some really astonishing figures that continue to blow my mind, even though I've been reading this study over and over for a good 12 years or so. This came out in 2000 in the Journal of Vegetation Science. Again, I'll spare you the methodology, but you can check the study linked in the show notes. There were a couple of plants that have really astonishingly long median lifespans in excess of a couple hundred years. A couple of chollas, pencil cholla, the upper reaches of longevity for pencil cholla for that top 5% are just shy of 600 years. Iodine bush, Thamnosma montana, that oldest 5% could expect to live for 1,151 years. It's a long time. Blackbrush, a really important plant, especially in the southern end of its range in the Mojave. It's a crucial nurse plant for Joshua trees. About 5% of them can expect to live for 1,200 years. California buckwheat, the top 5%. Survival rate, 712 years. There's a bunch of really long-lived plants in this area. You get the idea. And there were some species that Cody couldn't actually do the actuarial calculations on because none of the plants had died in that 15 years, which can only lead one to suspect that they may live for a very, very long time. Those plants were Ephedra nevadensis, Mormon, unsurprisingly, creosote bush, buckhorn cholla, and Yucca shedidra, or Mojave yucca. Mind you, having 5% of a population living that long may seem like a really small amount. But when you think about how many creosote bushes are in the desert, when you think about how many blackbrushes are in the desert, or Mojave yuccas and Mormon teas, you can basically conclude that there are tens of thousands of plants more than a millennium old growing in the deserts of North America. And that's not even looking at plants like trees in mountains up above the hottest part of the desert or in dry washes. And it's not looking at plants that for one reason or another weren't found in the Cody study plot or the photographs that Bowers, Webb, etc. looked at. When you think about the way plants germinate in the desert, the longevity documented by Bowers et al. And by Cody really makes sense. Most of these plants are going to rely, at least in part, on setting seed, having that seed germinate, and having the new plants live long enough to reproduce themselves. In the desert, most years, the conditions for germination just aren't going to happen. Conditions for germination and recruitment, which is the other word for survival of the germinating plants until they're old enough to reproduce, are sporadic. Blackbrush needs about 5 cool, wet years, relatively cool and wet, in the desert for any seeds to be produced and germinate and then live long enough that they have a shot at getting to maturity. And coleogeny isn't particularly unusual for a lot of these things. When you have a landscape that's characterized by drought, it's safe to assume that most germination of seeds is going to take place in the wettest possible years. And when those wettest possible years come once every 25 or 50 or 100 years, the plants that have very long lifespans are going to fare better, evolutionarily speaking. If you have 100 creosote bushes and you have a 500-year drought, that's not enough to kill creosotes outright, but enough to keep them from germinating successfully, then having those 5 out of that 100 creosote bushes able to survive longer than the drought, that'll make sure that there will be creosotes in the future. And that's not even getting into the survival of organisms and reproduction through clonal offshoots of one kind or another, which is how king clone came to be. It's how Mojave yuccas often reproduce and maintain themselves in the landscape as incredibly old, large clumps of yucca. Many chollas propagate almost exclusively through vegetative reproduction, aka cloning, aka, oh my God, this goddamn stem of cholla just got stuck in my pant leg. Let me drop it on the ground here and walk away. Cylindropuntia bigelowii, teddy bear cholla, doesn't set fertile seeds. There is a sort of geeky reason for this. Teddy bear cholla is triploid. It's got 3 copies of each chromosome in each cell. And that makes it really hard to set viable seed because you need to have an even number of chromosomes in order for the seed to be viable. Because when you do mitosis to make those seeds, you're splitting your genome in half and then reassembling it. If you've got odd numbers of chromosomes, it means that sexual reproduction through seed production is going to be unlikely. So every patch of teddy bear cholla that you see is very likely all grown from a single stem of teddy bear cholla that latched onto an animal and moved to a new place. There are places like the Bigelow Cholla Garden Wilderness in the Mojave Desert in California that have square miles of cholla, probably all from the same one piece of cholla that got moved there somehow, some countless thousands of years ago. And that just grew and grew and broke off and rolled around, got washed downhill in the washes, more grew, and I haven't seen anybody even think about how to calculate the age of a patch like that. Let me know if you've done it. I think that'd be a really fascinating doctoral thesis. If all the chollas in the Bigelow Cholla Garden are genetically identical, which is very likely, how long would it take for one piece of cholla to grow into an entire valley full of cholla? So this is all interesting if you like old plants, but to me, it says something about the desert that I think if more people knew about it, they'd be a lot more cautious about what they did in the desert. You think about places back east or on the West Coast where a 300-year-old tree, which might have been planted by George Washington or was there when the first settlers got to Santa Barbara or whatever. You get people with 200 or 300-year-old trees in their neighborhood and they want to defend them. They see them as elders, as ancient, and rightly so. And if you show up with a bulldozer to build a strip mall, people are going to climb that tree and not come down. And that's fair. 300 years is respectable for a coast live oak or a pin oak back east, growing in an urban environment, sugar maples. You get redwoods that are properly revered for their lifespans in excess of 2 millennia, if they're lucky. Bristlecone pines in the White Mountains and elsewhere, getting up towards 5,000 years, some of them. Revered worldwide for their advanced age. And meanwhile, there are probably hundreds of thousands of creosote bushes, probably tens of thousands of Mojave yuccas that are older than the oldest bristlecone pine. Shouldn't we revere them too? Shouldn't we take into account their age when we're talking about bulldozing a section of desert for a new Airbnb complex or a new solar field? Either of which is probably going to last 20 years. Isn't it hubris to think that we know better how to use a piece of land than a plant that's been living there for tens of centuries? Just a thought. And I said at the beginning of this episode that Joshua trees, as short-lived as they are compared to a lot of these things, will in certain circumstances survive for much longer than the 250 or so years that is taken as their typical lifespan these days. In the western part of their range, western Joshua trees are extremely likely to grow and reproduce through cloning themselves. For some reason, in the western part of the range over by Los Angeles and Ridgecrest, California, Joshua trees will clone themselves more often than they set seed and have that seed germinate. And as a result, you get huge clumps of Joshua trees that have common roots that probably all germinated from the same seed at one point or another and send up a main stem. That main stem gets side shoots like the creosote. They're called stolons. Those stolons will grow into their own individual stems of Joshua tree. They look like separate plants, but they are not. They are the same plant with multiple trunks. And after 250 years or so, some of those trunks will die back, but the plant itself keeps living through putting up new trunks. So in that one area, under certain circumstances, some very small percentage of the total number of Joshua trees of both species that live in this world might reach ages in excess of 1,000 years. But that doesn't mean an individual stem of Joshua tree is going to ever live more than 300 years. And with that excessively nuanced thought, we are wrapping up this episode of 90 Miles from Needles, the Desert Protection Podcast. I want to thank Anna Stump for joining our Patreon supporters. Good to have you aboard, Anna. Thanks go out as well to Joe Jeffrey, our voiceover guy, and Martine Mancha, our podcast artist guy. Our theme song, Moody Western, is by Brightside Studio. Other music in this episode comes to you via envato.com. I want to thank you for listening. Again, check us out at 90milesfromneedles.com if you are curious about our previous episodes. If you want to add a /donate to that URL, that'd be great. You can check out how you can help us out. In the meantime, take care of yourselves. The desert really needs you. And we will see you at the next watering hole. Bye now.
From Needles is a production of the Desert Advocacy Media Network.